You wake up in the dark to the smell of bread. That's the first thing before the aching, before the dust, before any of it. You wake in the gray dark to warm bread and wood smoke. On a reed mat on a mudbrick floor, packed in shoulder to shoulder with a row of other men who are already stirring, already coughing, already sitting up in the gloom, because somewhere out there a horn has sounded and the day does not wait for you. For one merciful heartbeat you don't remember where you are. Then you do. There is a low doorway with no door, just a reed mat pushed aside. There is the smell of the river and of donkeys and of 1,000 cooking fires. And when you duck out through that doorway into the cold blue morning, you see it. It is not finished. That's the thing that stops your breath. It rises off the edge of the plateau in the half-light, a mountain with straight edges, pale limestone catching the first gray of dawn, wrapped in a spider's web of ramps and ropes and timber, swarming already with tiny moving figures. Khufu's Great Pyramid. And it is going up, course by course, in front of you right now, and you are not here to look at it. You are here to lift it. So let me stop you right there, before that horn sounds again and a man with a tally in his hand starts counting heads, and tell you plainly, as kindly as I can, you would not last a week at this. Not the hauling, not the heat, not the sheer relentless grind of it, but stay with me, because almost everything you think you know about the men who built that mountain is wrong, and the truth is far stranger, far more organized, and in some ways far more human than the picture in your head. My name's Marcus, and I should tell you why I'm the one crouched here in the dust beside you while your eyes adjust to that impossible thing on the skyline. I used to teach history, mostly to teenagers, mostly badly, and ancient Egypt was the one topic that could shut a whole classroom up, because everybody thinks they know the pyramids. Slaves, whips, groaning masses dragging stone under a cruel sun while a man in gold points a stick. And then I fell down the hole that has quietly eaten my weekends for the last decade, which is reenactment and experimental archaeology. The mad, wonderful world of people who actually try to move a 2-ton block with nothing but rope, timber, water, and a lot of shouting, just to find out how it really felt in the body. And the pyramid builder is the one I keep coming back to, because it is the one we get the most wrong, and getting it wrong is a kind of insult to the people who actually did it. So I'm going to do 2 things at once today. I'm going to walk you through a week on this plateau, step by aching step, and every time we hit one of the things you're absolutely sure about, the slaves, the whip, the misery, I'm going to stop and check it against what the diggers have actually pulled out of the sand, because a startling amount of what you know is a film and the real thing is better. Come on. That horn's about to go again. First, let's kill the big one because you carried it down here in your bones. When you picture building a pyramid, you picture slavery. Rows of chained, whip-scarred wretches, hauling stone until they drop, a monument raised on the broken backs of an enslaved people. That is the image. We got it partly from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the fact and repeating what tour guides told him, and we got a hefty dose of it from Hollywood, from a century of films that needed a villain in gold and a sea of suffering slaves. It is a fantastic story. It is also, as far as the evidence goes, largely wrong, because the men who built the Great Pyramid were not slaves. Let that land, because it changes everything about the week you're standing in. There is no whip-master fantasy here. The people who raised Khufu's mountain were, by every serious line of evidence we now have, a paid, fed, housed, organized workforce, a mix of permanent skilled crews and rotating gangs of ordinary Egyptians doing their stint. Not the property of a tyrant. Something much more interesting, and in its own way much harder to escape. And I don't just want you to take my word for it, because I promised you I'd check things against the sand. So let me tell you how we actually know. For decades, an archaeologist named Mark Lehner and his team, a project called ERA, Ancient Egypt Research Associates, have been digging up something extraordinary just south of the pyramids, on the plateau you're standing on. Not a temple, not another tomb, a town. A whole workers' town, sometimes nicknamed the Lost City of the Pyramids. And what they found there does not look like a slave camp. It looks like a company town built to run an enormous project. They found long galleries, barracks where crews of workers slept. They found bakeries, industrial bakeries, with rows of bread molds stacked up, capable of turning out bread by the thousand. They found evidence of breweries, because beer was the other half of the ration. They found a whole operation for processing fish. And here's the detail that really ended the argument for a lot of people. They found the bones of huge quantities of cattle, prime beef, sheep, and goats. Somebody was driving herds of livestock to this plateau and feeding meat to the workers. You do not feed prime beef to slaves you intend to work to death. You feed it to a workforce you are provisioning, deliberately, at real expense, because you need them strong and you need them to keep coming back. That is the first great inversion of this whole story. The men who built the pyramid were fed better than most Egyptians in the villages beyond. And if the town wasn't proof enough, there's the cemetery. Because up on the plateau, in the very shadow of the pyramids, the archaeologist Zahi Hawass and others excavated the tombs of the workers themselves. Not grand tombs, modest ones, small mudbrick and rough stone tombs, some shaped like tiny pyramids of their own. But think about what that means. These laborers were buried with grave goods, with bread and beer for the afterlife, in the sacred ground beside the king they built for. A slave, a nameless captive worked to death, does not get a tomb in the holiest cemetery in the kingdom, in eternal sight of the pyramid. That honor was for people who mattered, people who were proud of what they had done. Some of them even left their titles. This was, in their own minds, the great work of their lives. So no, wipe the whip out of your head. You are not a slave this week. You are something the film never shows you, a worker, which, I'm sorry to tell you, will not save your soft modern body one bit. Because being a free, fed, respected pyramid worker in 2500 BC is still, physically, one of the most punishing jobs a human being has ever done. Let me show you why. So who are you exactly, in this crowd of men shuffling toward the plateau in the dawn? Most likely, you're not one of the permanent expert crews, the skilled masons and engineers who lived here year-round and did this for a career. Most likely, you're one of the rotating masses, an ordinary Egyptian, a farmer from some village up or down the river, called up to serve your stint. This is a thing historians call the corvée, a labor tax. In a kingdom with no coins, you paid what you owed the state and the god-king not in money but in your body, in weeks of work. And there was a beautiful, brutal logic to when they called you. They called you in the flood season. Every year the Nile rose and drowned the fields under water and black silt. That flood was the whole reason Egypt was rich. And while the water sat on the land, there was no farming to be done. Millions of strong farmers, suddenly idle for weeks. So the state gathered them up and pointed them at the pyramid. And that same flood floated the stone. Barges could ride the high water right up close to the plateau with blocks that would have been impossible to drag over land. It was, in its own grim way, a masterpiece of scheduling. You didn't have a choice about going, but you weren't in chains either. You were a conscript doing your season, and at the end of it, in theory, you went home. And the moment you arrive, you get swallowed into a machine of organization that, honestly, would put a lot of modern work sites to shame. Because you are not just a body in a mob. You are assigned to a gang. The whole workforce was carved up into big teams, gangs of maybe a couple of thousand men. And each gang was split down into smaller units the Egyptians called files, and those split down again into little crews of 10 or 20 who ate together, slept together, hauled together, and were counted together. You have a team. You have a foreman. You have a name. And I mean that literally. The gangs had names, and we know them, because the workers painted them in red ochre on the blocks, up inside the hidden relieving chambers above the king's chamber where nobody was ever meant to see them again. And the names are wonderful. They're not grim. They're proud, boastful, competitive team names. Crews called themselves things like the Friends of Khufu. Another, on a later pyramid, called itself the Drunkards of Menkora. Imagine painting that on the king's own monument. These are football team names. These are the names of men who were proud of their gang, who competed with the gang next to them to haul more, raise more, finish first. That is not the psychology of a slave. That is the psychology of a crew. And your soft modern self is about to discover exactly how much that crew is going to depend on you pulling your literal weight. So they feed you, and what they feed you is the engine of the entire pyramid. You want to know the true fuel that raised the greatest stone monument on Earth. It wasn't magic and it wasn't aliens, and I will fight anyone who says otherwise. It was bread and beer. Bread and beer were the ration, and they were very nearly the currency. Remember those industrial bakeries in the workers' town, churning out bread by the thousand in stacks of pottery molds? That was your wage and your dinner. Thick, dense, gritty loaves, gritty because the grindstones shed sand and stone into the flour, which, over a lifetime, filed people's teeth down to the roots. But that's a problem for future you. And beer, not the beer you're picturing, not a cold pint, but a thick, soupy, low-strength, nourishing barley brew, almost a liquid bread, full of calories, safer to drink than river water. Between them, bread and beer gave a hauling man the mountain of carbohydrate he needed to burn all day in the sun. Add the beef and fish and onions and pulses, and the ration was, by ancient standards, genuinely good. It had to be. Try to run a hauling gang on an empty stomach and you don't get a pyramid, you get a pile of collapsed men. So they fed you like the precious working animal you now are, which brings us at last to the work itself, and the moment your modern body starts filing for divorce. Because here is what you are actually going to do all day, every day, until your stint is done. You are going to move stone, unthinkable quantities of stone. The Great Pyramid is somewhere around 2 million blocks, most of them heavier than you, some of them vastly heavier, and every single one of them was moved by human and animal muscle. No machines, no wheels doing the heavy lifting, no pulleys as we'd know them. Rope, timber, sledges, water, and men. You, the everyday block, gets levered onto a wooden sledge, a heavy wooden sled with runners, and then a team of you throws ropes over your shoulders and hauls. And there's a lovely piece of evidence for a trick that made it possible. A famous ancient Egyptian painting shows a colossal statue being dragged on a sledge, and a man at the front is pouring water onto the sand in front of the runners. For years, people thought he was just performing a little ritual. He wasn't. Wet the sand to just the right dampness and it firms up. The sledge doesn't plow in and pile up sand ahead of it, and the pulling force needed drops dramatically. Physicists have actually tested this and it works. So your world is rope biting into your shoulder, A man calling the rhythm, the whole crew heaving as one on the beat, and someone up front keeping the sand perfectly, maddeningly damp, over and over, all day, in the heat. And the biggest, finest stone didn't even come from here. The beautiful, smooth, white casing limestone came from Tura, across the river, and the granite for the inner chambers came from Aswan, hundreds of miles up the Nile, which is how we get the single most astonishing document in this whole story. And it's my favorite thing I get to tell you today. In a place called Wadi al-Jarf, archaeologists found the oldest inscribed papyri in the world, and one of them is a logbook, a diary, kept by a man named Murer. Murer was an inspector, a middle manager in charge of a boat crew, and his job was to ferry that fine Tura limestone by river, load by load, to Giza for the building of the Great Pyramid. And his diary survives. We have the actual work log of a man hauling stone for Khufu's pyramid in his own hand, 45 centuries old. He records the trips, the crews, the deliveries. It is the most ordinary, most human thing imaginable, a supervisor's spreadsheet, and it is one of the most moving objects on Earth, because it turns the faceless mass of your fantasy into a named man doing a job, keeping his records, tired at the end of the day. Murer was real. His crew was real. And this week, on the receiving end of his boats, so are you. Now you've hauled the block across the sand to the foot of the pyramid. There's only one problem left, and it's a big one, straight up. How on earth do you get it up? 100, 200, 400 feet into the air, course by course, as the thing rises. And here I have to stop and be honest with you, because I promised I would. And this is the single most argued over question in Egyptology. We do not know for certain how they raised the stone. What we know is ramps, some system of ramps of mudbrick and rubble that let men drag the blocks up a slope instead of lifting them. But the exact shape is genuinely, fiercely debated. Some argue for one enormous straight ramp running up one face, simple, but it would have needed a mind-boggling amount of material of its own. Some argue for a ramp that wrapped around the outside of the pyramid in a spiral as it rose. Some argue for a ramp built inside the pyramid, hidden in the body of it. There's evidence at other sites for clever ramp-and post systems for dragging blocks up steep slopes. The truth is probably a combination, changing as the pyramid grew taller. But when someone tells you with total confidence exactly how the blocks went up, the accurate answer is, we're still arguing about it, and that's the honest, thrilling edge of the evidence. What is not in dispute is the part that matters for you. Whatever the shape of that ramp, it was your shoulder on the rope, dragging 2 tons up a slope in the sun again and again and again. And let's talk about that sun, because it is the quiet killer that would probably get you before the stone did. This is the edge of the desert. In the working months, the heat comes down like a physical weight, radiating back up off the pale rock and the sand until you're cooked from both sides. There is no shade on the face of a pyramid. Your body, hauling all day, is a furnace pouring out water, and you have to put every drop of it back or you fall over. That's a huge part of what the beer and the endless supply lines were really for: hydration, calories, salt, keeping a workforce of thousands from simply collapsing of heat and exhaustion. A modern office body dropped into this would be a heat stroke case by mid-morning of day 1. You have never sweated like this. You have never had to. Your whole soft life has been climate-controlled, and out here there is no controlling anything except how much water you can keep pouring down your throat between hauls. Now here's where the story turns surprising and kind again, in a way that will remind you of the cemetery. Because a job like this maims people. Multi-ton blocks, ropes under crushing tension, sledges that slip, men working at height on ramps, hands get crushed, feet get broken, backs give out, bones snap. The skeletons from the workers' cemetery show it plainly. Worn-down spines, arthritic joints, the bodies of people who did tremendously heavy lifting for years. But those same skeletons show something else, and it's beautiful. They show healed fractures. Broken arms and legs that were properly set, splinted, aligned, and allowed to knit back together straight. There's even evidence of survived amputations and of skulls that healed after serious injury. Think about what that tells you. When a worker was badly hurt on this site, somebody set his bones. Somebody splinted him and housed him and fed him bread and beer while he couldn't work and waited for him to heal. That is a workforce with medical care. That is a state that valued its laborers enough to mend them. It is the exact opposite of the disposable slave of the fantasy. And it is one more reason your image of this place has to change. It was hard, it was dangerous, it broke bodies, and it also caught them and set them and tried to keep them whole. So who's making sure you actually pull your weight? Not a whip master, an administrator. This whole plateau ran on scribes and overseers and tallies, men with reed pens counting the blocks, counting the rations, counting the heads, tracking which gang delivered what. Your foreman knows your crew's number. There are quotas, targets, deliveries expected. The pressure on you isn't the crack of a lash. It's the far more familiar modern pressure of a team depending on you, a supervisor watching the numbers, and a whole gang whose pride and whose ration is tied to hauling more than the drunkards of Menkora next door. You are not driven by terror. You are driven by organization, by belonging, by not being the man who let the crew down. And I promise you, having tried the tiniest fraction of this kind of work myself, that is a pressure that will empty you out just as thoroughly. Because I have done a version of this in my soft weekend way, and I want you to hear how badly it went. A few of us built a little wooden sledge, loaded it with a stone that wasn't even a fraction of a real block, threw ropes over our shoulders and tried to haul it across a field the old way, wetting the ground and calling the rhythm. And I will tell you two things. 1. The wet sand trick is real, and the moment it works you feel like a wizard. 2. It does not matter because it is still murder on the body. Within an hour the rope had rubbed my shoulder raw through my shirt. My lower back was one long complaint, and my hands had that hot, useless, trembling feeling where you can't grip anything. And I got to stop. I got to go home and lie on the sofa and be brought a cup of tea by my long-suffering wife, B, who looked at the rope burn on my neck and said, "You paid money to do this to yourself, didn't you?" A conscript at Giza did that all day in double the heat on a real 2-ton block, and then got up the next morning and did it again. You would not make it to the midday bread, so let's total up your first day honestly. You woke before dawn on a mat on a mudbrick floor, packed in with strangers, to a horn that doesn't care how you slept. You hauled a stone heavier than yourself across sand under a sun that would floor a modern body by lunchtime, with a rope grinding your shoulder to the bone. You dragged it up a ramp we still argue about the shape of. Your hands are shaking, your back has quit, and your crew is counting on you to be there in the morning to do it all again. And that's day 1. You're already dead. All right, not literally, not on the first day. This was, remember, a fed and watered and doctored workforce, and the whole system was built to keep you going, not to grind you into the sand. But the soft modern person who woke up inside this life this morning, the one used to comfort on demand, water on demand, a chair, a roof, a body that has never once been asked to haul stone from dawn to dusk, that person is finished. Not because the Egyptians were cruel, because you are soft, and this is the hardest honest labor the ancient world ever organized. So let's be fair about your actual odds, because I've spent a while telling you this wasn't a death camp, and I don't want you strolling off thinking it was a holiday. It absolutely was not. If you were a rotating conscript, the likeliest truth is this. You did your season, you were fed and housed and worked to the edge of what a body can take, and then you went home, back to your village, back to your fields as the flood went down, your labor tax paid for another year, carrying stories no one who hadn't done it would quite believe. Many men did exactly that over the 20-odd years it took to raise the thing. It was a stint, not a life sentence. But not everyone walked home. The work was genuinely dangerous. The crush injuries were real. The falls from height were real. The heat and the sheer grind wore bodies out young. Some men were carried to those modest tombs on the plateau because the work killed them, one way or another. The odds of any single day were survivable, but you multiply a dangerous day by a whole hot season of them, across a workforce of tens of thousands, across 2 decades, and the arithmetic gets heavy. It was better than the fantasy of mass death under the whip. It was still, for some, the last thing they ever did. Both of those are true at once, and I won't flatten either one for you. And here's where I turn all of it around on you, because I didn't drag you up onto that plateau at dawn just to make you grateful for your tap and your ceiling, though you should be. Here's the thing I keep bumping into every time I come back to these men. We look up at the Great Pyramid and we see a pharaoh. We see Khufu, one name, one king, one god on earth, and we hand him the whole miracle. But Khufu never lifted a stone. The thing that actually raised that mountain, the thing that is genuinely, jaw-droppingly miraculous about it, isn't one man's power. It's tens of thousands of ordinary people, organized, fed, housed, healed, and pulling on the same rope, on the same beat for 20 years, most of them never named, all of them long forgotten. The pyramid isn't a monument to a king. It's a monument to what regular human beings can do when they are fed and organized and working together at a scale that still doesn't feel possible. And that turns a question back on you, in your comfortable century. You are surrounded right now by pyramids of your own, the phone in your hand, the grid that powers your home, the road outside, the food that appears in your shop, every one of them raised by a faceless mass of people you will never meet, whose names you'll never learn, hauling on ropes you never see. We are so quick to hand the miracle to the one name at the top. The builders at Giza would want you to look past the king, to wonder, just for a second, about the crew, because you have never in your life built anything alone, and neither has anyone else. The pyramid just makes it impossible to pretend otherwise. So here's my question for you, and I read the comments genuinely, so tell me. If you'd been called up for your season on the plateau, which part do you honestly think would break you first? The hauling that wrecks your body, the heat that would floor you by lunchtime, or the sheer relentlessness of getting up every dawn to do it again? Be honest with yourself. Put it down below. I really want to know. I'm off to keep cheerfully toughening up my nephew Cody, who last week described carrying 2 bags of shopping up 1 flight of stairs as, and I quote, a whole workout. We are going to have a little chat about Murrer and his boats, and my reenactment mate Phil. The one who insisted the wet sand trick was nonsense right up until the sledge glided, and he fell over from pulling too hard against a load that suddenly gave, wants us to try building a proper little ramp next month, which means one of us is getting a barked shin and a lecture. And it is statistically always Phil. If standing on that plateau at dawn with me made you look at your soft, safe, tap-watered little life a bit differently. And if you want me to drop you into another world where you also, let's be honest, would not last, then subscribe and come back, because I've always got somewhere harder to take you. My name's Marcus. Mind the sand, and go pour yourself a glass of cold, clean water today on purpose. You've no idea how good you've got it.